0517 hours local time. The Strait of Hormuz lay shrouded in pre-dawn darkness when the first radar contact materialized on the carrier's surface search display. Then a second signature appeared, then a third. Within the blue-lit Combat Information Center, sailors who had maintained watch through the night hours leaned forward over their tactical displays, their faces bathed in the electronic glow of screens that were about to tell a story no one wanted to hear. The first report came through crisp and measured. New surface contact bearing 074, range 12 nautical miles. A brief pause as operators confirmed the signature. Second contact bearing 118, range 13 nautical miles. The third report followed moments later from the starboard lookout. Multiple contacts now developing across the search sector, 6 total signatures painting on the display. The main tactical screen showed the massive American carrier positioned at the center of the formation, a floating symbol of naval power transiting one of Earth's most strategically vital and closely monitored waterways. Around that central icon, 6 smaller radar tracks began forming a pattern that experienced naval officers recognized immediately and never wanted to see. These contacts were not crossing the shipping lane randomly. They were not maintaining shadowing distance from the formation. They were actively shaping the water around the American ships. The officer of the deck turned toward the captain, waiting for orders that would determine how this morning would unfold. The captain remained motionless at first, one hand gripping the bridge rail, eyes locked on the tactical feed as reports continued stacking one after another. Contacts maintaining speed 22 knots, contacts altering course inward, port side contacts now turning toward our track, starboard side contacts matching our heading and speed. Beyond the bridge windows, the carrier's flight deck stretched into the darkness, slick with sea mist and illuminated by red and amber deck lighting. Parked fighter jets sat chained along the deck edge, while sailors in colored jerseys moved between the aircraft with practiced efficiency, their helmets reflecting the glow from the island's superstructure. The ship was not yet at war, but it was no longer conducting routine transit operations. At 0519, the first bridge-to-bridge radio call went out across the international maritime frequencies. Unidentified surface vessels, this is United States Navy warship operating in international waters. Maintain safe distance and state your intentions. Only static answered through the speakers. The 6 radar tracks continued their inward movement, with the closest contact now registering under 10 nautical miles from the carrier's position. On the port bow, 2 Iranian warships moved in parallel formation, their wakes cutting pale lines through the dark water as they maintained course toward an intercept geometry. Further out, a third ship angled across the carrier's projected path, creating the forward element of what was becoming an enclosure pattern. On the starboard side, 2 additional contacts held station just outside the American defensive screen, close enough to create pressure but far enough to maintain plausible deniability of hostile intent. Behind the carrier formation, a 6th contact established position like a gate being systematically closed across the transit lane. The pattern was not yet a complete circle, but the geometry was unmistakably becoming one. Inside the Combat Information Center, the Surface Warfare Coordinator leaned over his console and called the report every bridge crew dreads to hear. CPA is decreasing on multiple contacts, closest point of approach now projected under 4 nautical miles if current courses and speeds are maintained. The captain finally spoke, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a commander who understood exactly what was developing around his formation. Maintain course and speed, log all contacts and maneuvers, no sudden movements, no dramatic course changes, no emergency acceleration. That represented the first critical decision of the encounter. The American carrier would not flinch under pressure. The second radio hail went out, this time transmitted slowly and clearly on multiple frequencies. Iranian naval vessels, this is United States Navy warship. You are maneuvering unsafely in close proximity to a U.S. aircraft carrier. Alter course immediately to ensure safe passage. Again, no acknowledgement came back through the radio speakers, no warning transmission, no explanation of Iranian intentions. Just 6 warships closing in disciplined silence while maintaining formation integrity. At 05:21, the carrier's escort vessels began their response. A U.S. destroyer positioned on the starboard quarter adjusted heading first, sliding outward from the protective screen with quiet precision as its radar arrays swept the contacts, now visible on the horizon. Dark hulls rose and fell against the low morning horizon line as the destroyer's bridge crew confirmed visual contact with the Iranian formation. A second escort shifted position behind the carrier, widening the defensive screen to counter the developing threat pattern. The carrier itself maintained steady course and speed, a floating airbase of steel and American naval power continuing its transit through the strait as if the pressure building around it simply did not exist. But every system aboard the massive warship was now fully alert and active. Long-range optical systems rotated toward the closest Iranian vessel, their lenses focusing on bridge windows and deck equipment. Electronic support measures began recording every radar emission and radio signal in the surrounding airspace. The carrier's air department received the tactical alert, and on the flight deck, a Seahawk helicopter was positioned for potential launch, its rotor blades still folded, but its air crew already conducting pre-flight preparations around the aircraft. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical picture continued sharpening with each radar sweep. Contact 1 holding 8.7 nautical miles, Contact 2 accelerating to 24 knots, Contact 3 crossing into forward sector, Contacts 4 and 5 maintaining starboard pressure, Contact 6 closing from aft quarter and completing the enclosure geometry. The pattern had become unmistakable to every experienced watch officer monitoring the display. The Iranian ships were no longer simply operating near the American formation. They were systematically building a tactical box around it. At 05:23, the first sliver of daylight cut across the water, and for several moments the entire tactical situation became visible from the carrier's island superstructure. 6 Iranian warships spread across the sea like dark blades, all angled toward the American formation with mathematical precision. A sailor on the bridge lifted binoculars and locked onto the closest enemy vessel. Visual contact confirmed. Iranian naval flag visible. Estimated length 300 feet. Forward gun mount covered. Multiple personnel visible on deck. The confirmation changed nothing tactically, but transformed the electronic contacts into real steel manned by real commanders making real decisions. On the flight deck below, sailors paused their work to look toward the horizon, unable to see the complete formation from their position, but sensing the change in the ship's operational posture. Deck announcements became shorter and more precise, movements became sharper and more focused. The air carried that strange, heavy tension that settles over naval vessels when decisions with strategic consequences are about to be made. At 05:24, the closest Iranian vessels adjusted course again, just a few degrees inward, not enough to constitute an overt attack run, but far too aggressive to be ignored by any prudent naval commander. The projected course line on the American tactical display now cut dangerously close across the carrier's bow, indicating the tactical ring was continuing to tighten around the formation. The captain observed the track development for 3 seconds, then 4, then 5, allowing the geometry to clarify before issuing his next order. Set defensive condition throughout the formation, no escalation without direct authorization, continue recording all activities and transmissions. Across the carrier strike group, the U.S. Navy responded without raising voices or creating visible drama. Escort vessels widened their defensive positions, sensor systems locked onto assigned contacts, camera systems began tracking Iranian movements. Radio frequencies remained open for any communication attempts. Every Iranian ship received a numerical designation for tracking purposes. Every course change was logged with precise timestamps. Every mile of closing distance was documented in the official record. The American carrier maintained its course and speed through the narrow waters. The 6 Iranian warships continued their coordinated closure. At 05:25 local time, the situation crossed an invisible line that no maritime chart could show. The U.S. carrier was no longer being merely observed or shadowed. It was being systematically surrounded. The carrier held its course. That represented the first decision that would determine everything else. 6 Iranian warships were now maneuvering around the American formation close enough to dictate its tactical options while remaining far enough away to hide behind the language of normal naval operations. No missiles had been launched. No weapons systems had been visibly manned. No Iranian commander had transmitted hostile intentions over the radio. But at sea, hostile intent does not require verbal declarations. Intent reveals itself through heading, speed, and distance measurements. Inside the Combat Information Center, the carrier's tactical display presented the developing problem in clean, unforgiving geometry. 3 Iranian vessels had positioned themselves forward of the carrier's track. 2 were applying pressure from the starboard side. 1 remained positioned aft, holding station in a way that made the formation appear less like a routine patrol and more like a closing trap. Forward contacts continuing adjustment inward, the surface warfare coordinator reported with professional calm. The captain absorbed the information without immediately responding, studying the screen before looking toward the officer of the deck. "Maintain present course and speed," he ordered. Outside the bridge windows, the strait was beginning to brighten as dawn spread across the water in thin gray illumination, revealing the shapes of the nearest Iranian hulls through the morning atmospheric haze. Their wakes appeared white and sharp against the dark water, indicating deliberate movement rather than random drift. These ships were not wandering independently. They were executing coordinated maneuvers. At 05:26, the second formal warning transmission went out across international maritime frequencies. Iranian naval vessels, this is United States Navy warship, conducting lawful transit through international waters. You are closing a U.S. aircraft carrier at unsafe distances. Alter course immediately to ensure safe passage. The message was repeated on the International Maritime Distress and Calling frequency, then transmitted again on a designated military coordination channel, then broadcast in Farsi to ensure language was not creating communication barriers. No reply came back through any frequency, only empty static across the radio spectrum. On the bridge, the communication silence carried more tactical significance than any hostile transmission would have carried. Hostile radio calls can be logged, translated, analyzed, and answered through established protocols. Radio silence leaves only movement and geometry to interpret intentions. The movement and geometry were becoming more threatening with each passing minute. Contact 2 increasing speed to 24 knots, a radar operator called from the Combat Information Center. Several seconds later, another report followed the first. Contact 4 matching our turn rate and maintaining bearing. The captain's facial expression tightened slightly, but his voice remained completely flat and controlled. Bring the defensive screen outward. The order moved through the formation with immediate effect. On the carrier's starboard quarter, a U.S. destroyer began sliding outward from its screening position, placing its hull between the carrier and the 2 Iranian ships, applying the most direct pressure from that sector. The destroyer's movement was controlled and professional, not aggressive or provocative in any way. Its wake widened behind the warship as it established position, like a defensive shield being drawn across the carrier's vulnerable flank. A second American escort adjusted its position aft, positioning itself to monitor the Iranian ship trailing behind the formation. No weapons were fired, no targeting systems were activated, no threatening maneuvers were executed. But the tactical message became visible from miles away across the water. The American aircraft carrier was not operating alone in these constrained waters. At 05:27, the Iranian ships provided their answer without transmitting a single word. One of the forward vessels executed a 5-degree turn inward toward the carrier's track. 5 degrees represents nothing significant to civilian observers watching from distant shorelines. At sea, 5 degrees of course change can determine whether 2 warships pass safely or force each other into crisis situations. CPA now 3.6 nautical miles, the Combat Information Center reported with clinical precision. Forward contact remains on crossing trajectory, closest point of approach. The measurement every naval bridge crew monitors when steel moves toward steel across the water. 3.6 nautical miles did not represent immediate collision range, not yet, but for a carrier strike group transiting through constrained waters while surrounded by 6 armed foreign vessels, the distance was too close to ignore and too deliberate to dismiss as coincidental maneuvering. The air boss received the next tactical order: prepare Seahawk helicopter for immediate launch. On the flight deck, the operational quiet transformed into controlled motion as deck crews moved around the helicopter with disciplined efficiency. Rotor blades unfolded into flight position. A pilot climbed into the cockpit and began final systems checks. The sensor operator verified the forward-looking infrared system was functioning properly. A crew chief leaned into the rotor wash and provided hand signals under the blue glow of deck lighting. The Seahawk was not being launched to attack Iranian vessels. It was being launched to observe and to be observed in return. Inside the carrier, electronic support measures teams began systematically collecting every signal the Iranian ships were emitting into the electromagnetic spectrum. Radar sweeps, navigation signals, communication bursts, short-duration pulses that appeared and vanished within seconds. None of it was dismissed as background noise. Every electronic emission became documented evidence. At 05:28, one of the Iranian vessels activated a higher-power surface search radar system. The warning appeared immediately at an electronic warfare console. New emission, bearing 086, Iranian surface search profile, medium power. The electronic warfare officer looked up from his display. They are actively painting the formation, sir. Not fire control radar yet, but no longer passive observation. The Iranian ship had transitioned from simply watching the American formation to actively measuring it, tracking course, speed, and defensive spacing with electronic precision. The difference was comparable to watching someone walk down a street versus placing a laser rangefinder on their chest and tracking their movement. The captain heard the report and provided his next order: record and classify all emissions, no electronic countermeasures at this time. That restraint was completely deliberate. The U.S. Navy possessed the capability to respond electronically with overwhelming force. It could flood the electromagnetic spectrum with jamming signals. It could push the Iranian radar systems into electronic confusion and blindness. But employing those capabilities too early would provide Iran with the escalation justification it might have been attempting to provoke. So the Americans maintained discipline. They observed, they recorded, they documented everything. At 05:29, the Seahawk lifted from the carrier's flight deck, its rotors beating the sea air into violent turbulence as spray lifted from the deck edge. The helicopter rose above the carrier's island structure, banked to port, and moved toward the forward Iranian ships at low altitude. From the aerial perspective, the tactical situation became much clearer. 6 Iranian warships were distributed around the American formation in a rough crescent shape, but the crescent was bending systematically inward. The forward ships were creating pressure ahead of the carrier's track. The side ships were narrowing the formation's room to maneuver. The aft ship was holding position just far enough back to complete the geometric shape. It was not a perfect circle of enclosure, but it did not need to achieve perfection to be tactically effective. The Seahawk leveled at 200 feet altitude and opened its warning broadcast. Iranian naval vessels, this is United States Navy aircraft. You are maneuvering unsafely in close proximity to a U.S. carrier strike group. Alter course and increase separation immediately. The message transmitted clearly across international frequencies. The Iranian ships continued their coordinated movement without altering course. No radio reply was received. The helicopter repeated the warning in Farsi to eliminate any possibility of language misunderstanding. Still no response from any Iranian vessel. At 05:30, the starboard U.S. destroyer rotated its forward gun mount several degrees, not enough to achieve a firing solution, but sufficient to be observed by Iranian lookouts. That represented the language of naval pressure conducted at the professional level. No shouting over radio frequencies, no warning shots fired across bows, just steel moving with deliberate purpose that could be interpreted correctly by any experienced naval officer. On the Iranian side, deck personnel were now clearly visible through American long-range optical systems. Men stood near railings observing the American formation. Several moved near equipment that remained under protective covers. No weapon systems were visibly manned at full readiness, but the posture aboard the Iranian vessels was no longer casual or routine. Forward contact, continuing closure. The Combat Information Center reported with the same professional calm that had characterized every previous report. Current range: 5.8 nautical miles from carrier position, 3.1 nautical miles from forward escort. The American destroyer continued moving outward, placing additional steel between the Iranian ship and the carrier's bow. For the first time since the encounter began, the Iranian formation faced a direct tactical choice: continue tightening the enclosure pattern and risk immediate confrontation with the American escort vessel, or adjust course and break the geometric integrity they had been building. At 05:31, the closest Iranian vessel maintained its course toward the American formation. The captain studied the tactical display one final time, then issued the order that fundamentally changed the operational tone of the entire morning. Bring air defense stations to full readiness. Maintain weapons-tight status. We are not escalating first. Across the carrier strike group, console displays changed status indicators. Watch teams leaned forward over their stations. Missile defense systems remained under positive control but achieved full readiness status. Camera systems zoomed to maximum resolution. Radar tracking systems refined their solutions. The Seahawk circled at low altitude over the water. Its sensors locked onto the Iranian lead ship. The first warning had been transmitted and ignored. The second warning had been transmitted and ignored. Now every Iranian ship in the tactical ring had received a numerical designation, an active track, and a defensive solution inside the U.S. Navy's combat systems. 0532 local time brought the warning tone from the electronic warfare console. Not dramatic, not loud, just sharp enough to make every operator in the Combat Information Center stop breathing for half a second. New emission, the electronic warfare officer called with controlled urgency, bearing 081. The captain turned his attention toward the console. The officer checked his signal classification again, his expression tightening. Possible fire control radar, short duration emission, Iranian contact 3. The operational environment changed immediately. Until that precise moment, the Iranian warships had represented a dangerous situation because of their movement, their speed, their formation discipline, and their refusal to acknowledge American warnings. But a fire control radar emission represented something fundamentally different. That was not simply observing or even measuring the American formation. That was the type of radar emission used to develop weapon engagement solutions. The signal had lasted only a few seconds before disappearing, then it vanished completely. But those few seconds contained enough information to cross a critical threshold. Confirm classification, the captain ordered. Signal matches fire control profile stored in library. Intermittent transmission, not continuous lock achieved. Not continuous, therefore not an immediate launch sequence, not yet, but the tactical line had been crossed. On the main display, Contact 3 was positioned forward of the carrier's projected path, angled inward, maintaining speed just above 22 knots. Its wake stretched behind it like a white scar across the dark water surface. From external observation, it appeared to be simply one warship among 6 others. Inside the American combat system, it had just become the primary focus of the entire encounter. The captain's voice maintained its controlled calm. Set condition 1 for air defense throughout the formation. Weapons remain tight. Record all electronic emissions. The order flowed through the carrier like electrical current through steel. Across the massive warship, watch stations achieved maximum readiness. In the Combat Information Center, operators leaned closer to their displays. On the bridge, binoculars locked onto the forward Iranian vessel. On the flight deck, crews moved with increased urgency while maintaining professional discipline. The American carrier continued holding its original course through the strait. That decision carried enormous significance. If the ship altered course away from the Iranian formation at this point, the Iranian Navy could claim their pressure tactics had succeeded. If the carrier turned toward the Iranian ships, the risk of escalation would increase dramatically. So the U.S. Navy selected the most difficult option available. It maintained steady course and speed. At 0533, the final formal warning went out across all frequencies. Iranian naval vessel bearing 081. This is United States Navy warship. Your radar emissions and unsafe maneuvering are being recorded as hostile indications. Cease hostile activity and alter course immediately. The transmission was repeated in Farsi with precise pronunciation. The Iranian ship did not acknowledge the warning. Instead, Contact 3 made another small course adjustment, 2 degrees further inward, a minor turn by navigation standards, a dangerous escalation by naval standards. CPA now 2.9 nautical miles from carrier track, the Combat Information Center reported. Contact 3 maintaining closure rate. The captain looked toward the Air Operations Officer, Launch Combat Air Patrol. On the flight deck, the first FA-18 Super Hornet was already positioned on the number 1 catapult. Steam curled beneath its fuselage as the aircraft achieved full readiness. The pilot sat strapped in with visor down and oxygen mask sealed. A catapult shooter crouched beside the nose landing gear with one hand raised, waiting for the final launch signal. The jet's twin engines glowed blue in the gray morning light. The launch signal came. The shooter dropped his hand toward the deck. The catapult fired. The Super Hornet exploded forward down the deck and into the sky above the formation. Seconds later, a second aircraft followed, climbing hard over the carrier's bow. Both fighters lit their afterburners, flashing orange against the morning haze as they turned toward the Iranian formation. No air-to-surface missiles were visible on the aircraft. No bomb bay doors were open. Just American air power arriving overhead with unmistakable authority. At 05:35, the starboard U.S. destroyer executed its most significant maneuver of the encounter. It accelerated slightly and cut across the widening gap between the carrier and the 2 Iranian vessels, applying the most direct pressure from the starboard side. The maneuver was mathematically precise, not an aggressive charge, not a direct threat, but a calculated placement of American steel in the one area the Iranian formation needed to keep open for their tactical plan to succeed. On the destroyer's bridge, the closest Iranian hull was now visible without optical magnification. Dark gray paint, low-profile design, bow wake rising, personnel clearly visible along the deck edge. The forward gun mount on the Iranian ship remained under its protective cover. But the ship's search radar continued sweeping across the American formation. Inside the destroyer's Combat Information Center, Aegis tracking systems multiplied and refined their solutions. Track 3 designated priority target, Tracks 4 and 5 maintaining starboard pressure. Track 6 aft, no significant change. The destroyer's own forward gun mount rotated several degrees, again not sufficient to establish a firing solution, but enough to communicate intent that any professional naval officer would understand correctly. Above the water, the Seahawk maintained its wide, low orbit with cameras locked onto Contact 3. The sensor operator zoomed in on the Iranian bridge windows, then the radar mast, then the deck lines where personnel were moving. Every second was precisely time-stamped. Every movement was digitally stored. The helicopter transmitted its message again. Iranian warship, you are creating dangerous approach geometry. Alter course immediately. No reply was received. At 05:36, the fire control emission appeared again, this time lasting slightly longer than the previous signal. The electronic warfare officer did not need to raise his voice. Same contact, same bearing, fire control emission confirmed and extended. The captain studied the tactical display for several seconds. Do not illuminate back. Continue recording all activity. That represented tactical discipline at the highest professional level. The carrier strike group possessed the capability to respond with overwhelming electronic warfare measures. It could jam, blind, and confuse the Iranian systems completely. It could flood the entire electromagnetic spectrum. It could place every hostile contact inside defensive engagement envelopes. But responding too aggressively too early would provide the Iranian Navy with the escalation narrative it wanted to create. So the U.S. Navy held the tactical line. It allowed Iran to transmit and reveal its capabilities. It allowed the electronic warfare systems to collect everything. At 05:37, the two Super Hornets arrived overhead and established controlled orbits above and forward of the carrier formation. They did not execute aggressive diving passes on the Iranian ships. They did not perform provocative flyovers. They established professional combat air patrol patterns high enough to avoid direct provocation, close enough to be clearly observed by every bridge crew below. From the Iranian deck perspective, the tactical message would have been impossible to misinterpret. The American aircraft carrier was fully alert. The escort vessels were positioned defensively. The combat aircraft were overhead and ready. The entire formation was being monitored from every possible angle and sensor system. Contact 3 continued its forward movement for another 20 seconds, then 30 seconds more. The range measurements dropped again. 4.2 nautical miles from carrier, the Combat Information Center called. 2.7 nautical miles from forward escort vessel. The American destroyer held its defensive position without yielding. The Iranian ship now faced its clearest tactical choice of the entire encounter: continue inward movement and force direct confrontation with the American escort, or turn away and break the geometric integrity of the enclosure pattern. For several long moments, nothing changed across the water. Only the sea moved. Only the radar systems swept. Only the chronometers counted down toward decision points. Then Contact 3 reduced speed. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. 22 knots became 20, then 19. The course change came next, 3 degrees outward, away from the American formation, small on the tactical display, enormous in tactical significance. Contact 3 is opening CPA, the Surface Warfare Coordinator reported. Enclosure pattern integrity is weakening. No one in the Combat Information Center celebrated the development. The captain simply nodded once. Maintain pressure, continue documentation. The situation was not resolved. 5 Iranian ships remained in coordinated motion around the formation. 2 still held the starboard pressure points. 1 maintained its position aft. The forward ship that had just turned away had not retreated completely. It had simply stopped its most aggressive closure, but the first significant crack had appeared in the Iranian tactical plan. The Iranian formation had attempted to turn the water around the American carrier into a trap. The U.S. Navy had responded with sensors, aircraft, escort positioning, and professional restraint sharp enough to cut through the pressure. It had not fired weapons. It had not retreated. It had forced the most dangerous ship in the enclosure pattern to make the first tactical adjustment. At 05:39, the tactical display showed the new geometric picture. The circle was still visible, but it was no longer tightening systematically. The Iranians had built an enclosure around the carrier formation. The U.S. Navy had just built a defensive cage around the enclosure. 05:40 local time, the tactical ring remained in place. 6 Iranian warships continued operating around the carrier strike group, distributed across the water in a formation designed to apply pressure, create confusion, and compress American options. But the geometric shape was no longer clean and coordinated. 1 forward ship had already reduced speed. Another had opened its angle by several degrees. The first systematic break had appeared in the Iranian plan. The U.S. Navy moved immediately to exploit it. On the tactical display inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, American escort vessels shifted positions like pieces on a chessboard. 1 destroyer held the starboard gap, placing itself between the carrier and the 2 Iranian ships applying pressure from that sector. A second destroyer moved aft, positioning itself between the carrier and the Iranian vessel trailing the formation. A cruiser adjusted forward, widening the defensive screen across the carrier's bow. No American ship moved randomly or emotionally. No ship accelerated dramatically. Every course change served a specific tactical purpose. Defensive screen is extending, the surface warfare coordinator reported. Carrier remains protected across all threat sectors. The captain observed the Iranian tracks beginning to react to American movements. That represented the crucial shift. Until this moment, Iran had been forcing the tactical geometry. Now the geometry was forcing Iran to make reactive decisions. At 0541, the Seahawk descended to lower altitude over the forward sector, maintaining a wide orbit around the most aggressive Iranian ship. Its sensor systems continued recording high-resolution video, infrared imagery, range data, course changes, wake patterns, everything. Inside the helicopter, the sensor operator kept cameras fixed on the Iranian bridge structure. Bridge crew visible, multiple personnel topside, no visible weapon systems manned. The pilot maintained the aircraft steady, not too close to create provocation, not too high to reduce effectiveness, close enough to remind the Iranian crew that they were being continuously observed, high enough to deny any claim of dangerous flyover tactics. The broadcast went out again. Iranian naval vessels, this is United States Navy aircraft. You are operating in unsafe formation near a U.S. carrier strike group. Increase separation immediately. This time, visible movement followed the warning. One Iranian ship on the starboard side reduced speed by 2 knots. Then a second ship made similar adjustment, small changes in absolute terms, but in naval standoff situations, small changes represent how commanders retreat without admitting it publicly. At 0542, the Super Hornets completed their first orbit over the formation. From below, their silhouettes crossed the morning sky in controlled arcs that demonstrated air superiority without direct threat. They did not dive toward Iranian ships. They did not execute threatening maneuvers. They simply maintained overhead presence, locked into combat air patrol patterns that transformed the water below into completely monitored battle space. On the carrier's flight deck, additional aircraft were being prepared but not launched. That was deliberate tactical signaling. The U.S. Navy was displaying capacity without flooding the sky with aircraft. Pressure, not panic. Readiness, not recklessness. At 0543, the forward U.S. cruiser's radar picture achieved maximum resolution. 3 Iranian ships were now being tracked simultaneously in the same defensive sector. Their headings still pointed inward toward the formation, but their speeds no longer matched the coordinated pattern. The tactical synchronization was deteriorating. Contacts 1, 2, and 3 no longer maintaining coordinated closure rates, the Combat Information Center reported. That single sentence carried enormous tactical significance. A naval formation only functions effectively if every unit maintains the operational plan. Once speeds change, once angles widen, once one captain hesitates while another continues pressing forward, the geometric shape begins failing systematically. The Iranian enclosure was failing. At 0544, one Iranian vessel attempted to regain tactical pressure. It turned back toward the carrier's projected track, trying to close the forward gap that had opened during the previous few minutes. The maneuver appeared instantly on every American tactical display. Contact 2 altering inward, possible attempt to reform enclosure line. The captain showed no surprise at the development. Shift destroyer 5 degrees to port, hold the intercepting lane. The American destroyer responded immediately. Its bow came left, its wake widened. Its hull moved into the exact patch of water the Iranian ship needed to occupy for tactical success. Not fast enough to create collision risk, not slow enough to invite further pressure, just precise enough to force the Iranian captain into another choice. Maintain course and create documented collision risk, or turn away from confrontation. For 20 seconds, both warships held their converging courses. The range closed steadily. 3.2 nautical miles, 2.8 nautical miles. On the destroyer's bridge, the Iranian ship was completely visible without optical aids. Gray hull, national flags snapping in the wind, radar antennas rotating, personnel moving behind bridge windows. The destroyer's captain issued no dramatic orders. Steady as she goes, that was sufficient. At 05:45, the carrier transmitted the final warning of the encounter sequence. Iranian vessels, your formation is creating unsafe approach geometry around a United States Navy carrier strike group. Increase distance immediately. Continued closure will be treated as escalatory activity. The message was repeated in Farsi with careful pronunciation. This time, radio silence did not follow. A transmission broke through, distorted by static and atmospheric interference, difficult to interpret clearly. United States vessel, maintain your current heading. We are conducting routine naval operations. The American reply came back immediately, flat and professional. Iranian vessels, your maneuvers are being recorded as hostile. You will increase separation. No argument, no negotiation, no change in the carrier's course or speed. At 05:46, Contact 2 executed an outward turn. The American destroyer held its intercepting lane. The Iranian ship's wake shifted direction. Its bow opened away from the American formation. The forward gap widened significantly. Inside the carrier's combat information center, no one celebrated or relaxed. Operators continued calling range measurements. Electronic warfare teams maintained their emission logging. The Seahawk remained overhead. The Super Hornets continued their orbits. This was what tactical control looked like at the professional level, not explosions or dramatic maneuvers. A systematic series of decisions that provided the opposing force with fewer and fewer viable options. At 05:47, the aft Iranian ship began dropping back from its position. It had been maintaining station behind the carrier formation like the final piece of the tactical box. Now the range opened from 6 nautical miles to 7, then 7.5 nautical miles. The aft screening destroyer reported the change first. Contact 6, opening distance from formation. The surface warfare coordinator studied the main tactical display. Rear pressure is reducing significantly. That development broke the geometric shape completely. Without the aft ship maintaining its position, the enclosure was no longer an enclosure. It was simply a loose cluster of vessels operating near a carrier strike group that had regained control of the water around itself. At 05:48, the Seahawk completed another wide orbit and climbed to 500 feet altitude. Its camera systems captured the entire tactical situation from above. The American carrier still moving straight through the Strait of Hormuz. American escort vessels spread in disciplined defensive arcs. Iranian ships no longer synchronized, no longer closing as a coordinated unit. The aerial image communicated more than any radio transmission could express. The attempted enclosure had failed systematically. At 05:49, 3 Iranian vessels had reduced speed below coordinated levels. 2 had altered course outward from the formation. The final ship remained near the edge of the American defensive screen, but alone, its position no longer carried tactical meaning. An enclosure only functions when every side maintains pressure. Iran had lost the enclosure. The U.S. Navy had achieved this result without firing a single weapon. It had not needed to employ kinetic force. It had used aircraft, escort positioning, electronic systems, optical surveillance, and command discipline to reclaim the battle space one sector at a time. On the carrier's bridge, the captain observed the range measurements increasing on every contact. "Maintain present course and speed," he said. The massive warship continued its transit. Behind it, the white wake stretched clean across the narrow waters. At 05:49, the Iranian formation broke apart, not with explosion, but with geometry. 0550 local time. The radar picture finally began opening across all sectors. For 33 minutes, 6 Iranian warships had applied coordinated pressure around the American carrier strike group, shaping the water, narrowing tactical angles, and testing exactly how much pressure a U.S. carrier would absorb before reacting with force. Now the tactical shape was systematically falling apart. One forward Iranian ship had turned outward. 2 on the starboard side had reduced speed below coordination levels. The vessel trailing behind the carrier formation was opening distance significantly. The formation still existed on the water surface, but it no longer possessed tactical weight or geometric control. Inside the carrier's combat information center, the tactical display showed what every officer had been working toward. Contact 1 opening, Contact 2 opening, Contact 6 increasing separation aft. The surface warfare coordinator looked up from his console. Tactical enclosure is broken. No one cheered or applauded the development. The carrier maintained its course and speed. That was the essential point. On the bridge, the captain observed the Iranian ships through forward windows, then shifted his attention back to the tactical display. The American formation had not altered its mission. It had not reversed course. It had not surrendered the transit lane. It had simply absorbed the tactical pressure, documented every threat, and systematically forced the opposing side to exhaust its options. "Maintain present course and speed," he repeated. The helmsman acknowledged. "Maintain present course and speed, aye." Outside the bridge, morning light had reached the Strait of Hormuz completely. The dark water was now blue-gray, broken by long white wakes from ships that had spent the previous half-hour maneuvering within seconds of potential escalation. The U.S. carrier remained at the center of the scene, massive, steady, and continuing forward. Above it, Super Hornets maintained their protective orbit. Below them, the Seahawk began its final surveillance pass. The helicopter's cameras captured each Iranian ship individually, recording hull numbers, wake directions, deck activity, radar mast movements, bridge window positions. Every element of the encounter was stored, time-stamped, and prepared for intelligence analysis. This was not simply surveillance activity, it was proof of what had occurred. At 0552, the nearest Iranian vessel transmitted again. The message was brief, wrapped in static, and tactically significant. "United States vessel, Iranian naval units are resuming normal patrol patterns." The American reply came back immediately. "Iranian vessels, maintain safe separation from this carrier strike group. Nothing additional, no insults, no threats, no victory declarations." The U.S. Navy did not need verbal victory statements. The water was already communicating the results. At 0555, the Seahawk turned back toward the carrier for recovery. Its rotor wash created thin sheets of spray as it crossed behind the starboard escort vessel. On the flight deck, recovery crews prepared landing area. The helicopter approached smoothly, nose steady, landing gear settling onto the deck with solid metallic contact. A deck crewman moved in low and fast to secure the aircraft. Mission complete, the Super Hornets remained airborne. That was deliberate tactical signaling. Even after the enclosure,